very brightly colored and it's very loud, and it's fun for a while.
We want to be free to do what we want to do.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barker, the president of Hell's Angels.
This is 1095. Cool, we did it. We're on. Technically we're on, and we're in two countries, right? So I'm here in Pai. Mona, you are in
Chiang Mai.
And Paddy, you are
in Tasmania.
Cool. So late afternoon there, I imagine. So So I think as way of intro for the audience, so we, Paddy, you and I know each other for about maybe 10, 15 years, I'm not sure, on and off, from my time in a monastery many moons ago. And we did a podcast maybe a couple of years ago about your work, running men's group, about your work in the Buddhist sector and everything else. And then Mona and I know each other from Pai. We work together, and you and I were going to do a podcast today and talk about really men's health, what's going on with boys, men, not just in Australia, but we will talk a lot about that because of the work you're doing. But I think also the East versus West, and a bit of a kind of open dialogue. But then I thought, two guys talking about it, great. But wouldn't it also be good to have, a woman's perspective? And I think, Mona, without me doing an intro, but I think your perspective as well is also well nuanced in your upbringing, where you've come from, where you've lived. So rather than me explain that, let's just do a couple of guest intros to give some background. Mona, starting with you, because I think that'll help to shed light.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Paddy. Nice to meet you. So I'm Mona. I was born and I grew up in India. I was in India until I was the age of 25, and then I moved to New York, where I was married, and then we parted ways in 2014. And afterwards, I was working in corporate tech, and I left my job in 2018 to seek much more meaning in life. I was looking for answers, and I think I had this inclination to find answers since I was a kid. So while I was growing up in India, I used to have a spiritual practice for 10 years. I would get up early in the morning, practice, and sleep before sleeping, chanting mantras, fasting 3 times a week. I was very much dedicated to finding God and figure out why there is suffering, and I didn't find the answers at that point of time. And when I left my job in New York, I came to India to travel, and that's where I did my first Vipassana, and it changed the course of my life. And after that, I came to Thailand to study and practice meditation, which I did in 2019 and 2020, and that's led me to get stuck in Thailand. And then I moved to Mexico, and then I'm back. So it's like a small, brief history. So I'm a practitioner of Vipassana, but I would not even call myself as that anymore. So I've learned something over the course of a year, but we'll see. I think ignorance is revealed in retrospect, right? So I can't say if I'm wise. All I would know is later in the game. So we'll see. Yeah, that's about me.
Cool. Cheers, Mona. Maybe Paddy, you want to give an intro as well? My very short intro probably didn't recover too much. So
yes, I live in the middle of Tasmania, the island south of Australia, and I'm 79, and I work from home, and I do a lot of counselling work, writing, and men's work. And my latest project is to campaign in our upcoming federal election to establish an Office of Boys and Men, which is, controversial. But talking to politicians over the last 30 years has never got anywhere. So by campaigning in the election, we'll be the squeaky door hoping to get oiled. So we'll get listened to. Not just men, mothers of boys, and especially we're targeting marginal seats in rural and regional and outer suburban areas where the trend of men shifting away from progressive parties and some women is a reality around the world, as has been seen in the latest American election. So I'm busily in the midst of that, and yeah, it's really engaging me.
Cool. Maybe a good starting point. Do you want me to bring up your little cartoon and we can talk through it contextually? Let me just see if I can. Should be able to screen share it, I think. Can you see it?
Yep.
If you guys can see it, then everyone can see it. Maybe you want to just.
Yeah, now I can see it. Yeah.
Cool. Maybe just give us some context, Paddy. Why you did this, what it's about, how it links into everything, and then we can talk about the specifics a little bit.
Yes, when I did my proposal and finalised it after a lot of research, it's a 6-page document. I sent it out for feedback to women and men, and it was interesting. I was getting a diversity of responses, and I realised that this was a very class-based thing. And I've called that in the cartoon upstairs for, the elite or white collar, and downstairs for the working class. And that's a universal thing again around the world. And I'd hit that. And on the upper left, you're representing upper class women who, progressive, pretty well caught up in the ideology of the women's movement and seeing this proposal as a threat to women's programs. So saying, I'm not interested. And that came from a guy I'd sent it to who had spoken to a senior woman in the local Progressive Party, and her automatic reaction was, no, men have got everything. So on the right-hand side, you've got the upper class or college-educated men, and they're a bit freaked out about supporting this because they don't want to be called a toxic male or a misogynist and opposing women, because they're in their social network. That's a taboo. So they're shutting up. They're not going to say anything. And down the bottom, you've got represented the working class women who are more pragmatic and, my man is good. He's not toxic. His workmate committed suicide. My boys are struggling at school. So I'm really interested in this. And then on the right-hand lower side, the man is saying helping boys and men, that's new, that's unusual. Hey, and that's really good. And I'll believe it when I see it, and got the boy saying with your dad. So I decided to sort of do a cartoon of this because it's such a complex and nuanced topic. Just words don't do it. So I taught myself how to create cartoons. So that's it. Does that make sense to anyone?
Yeah, and by the way, I was going to say, Mona, feel free to jump in with questions at any time. This is kind of not me just
sure.
interviewing. It's more of a kind of, hey, we're having a coffee and we're having a chat. But it does make perfect sense. It's really interesting to me. So many things are class-based, frankly. So many things when you get down to the nuts and bolts, when you look at race issues, and class comes into so many things. So it's interesting that you split it out that way. At the top, where you're looking at, if you want to call it the elite, that seems to me, and you're talking Australia, but I would say it's quite representative of what we're seeing in the West, probably. And when at least in the UK, in the US, in Australia, would you kind of agree with that? And that's kind of how I take it. The bottom layer, the working class bit, I have less. Where do you get that from? I suppose I agree with it, but also my agreement is anecdotal based on the few friends I have who I would put in those boxes. So I'm kind of like, interested to hear. Is there something behind that in terms of how you made that assessment? Is that through the conversations you have? Is there more to support that out of interest?
Look, it's sort of accepted that working class women, or the lower SES group of women, enjoy the benefits of women's gender programs, equal pay, and everything else. Job security, extra money. That's terrific. But they don't share in the ideological side of feminism about the patriarchy and toxic masculinity and all that sort of stuff. So they're far more pragmatic, and the ideology doesn't attract them.
Yeah.
So, and that's also some of my personal experience, but I can talk about that later maybe.
Because it's, can I say something?
Go for it.
I'm processing that image, and it's like, if we would have had to conduct this survey in India, I think it would be reversed. That's my understanding. And I think
That's interesting.
the reason it would be is because the upper middle class and people in the privileged sector are much more into like social justice and these kind of issues. And in the lower middle class, or if you can say like the working class, they're more engaged in engaging in surviving and making their lives better, and they don't think about all these aspects of, okay, what's happening in the world, like what's the suicide rate across India, what's going on, because these are not the topics that interest them. And even like feminism is not something that interests people. It's more of to like, okay, how do we make our family life better and our with respect to our society. So I have I have a feeling if this research was conducted in India, it would be different. And also to the point of Australia, it seems to me like the upper uh, class of the upstairs in your cartoon that you depicted are much more inclined to the social justice aspect. And in that, like they want to, maintain the feministic or the feminism point of view, and because they want to maintain that, they don't want to like go against it. That's why they don't want to speak for men's health. I mean, that's just my understanding and my maybe a small conclusion, like why it might be happening. I don't know if it makes sense.
I think the situation varies around the world. In Western developed countries, you've got a fairly highly developed women's movement, and the political movement so far, progressive parties have been very focused on that as part of their sort of identity politics. And in Australia and elsewhere, the Labor Party here, a progressive party, used to represent the working class, but that's no longer the case and hasn't been for some years. It now really represents the progressive class, inner city cosmopolitan, and the Conservative Party now represents more the working class, which is really a total reversal.
That's the same in the US and the same in the UK, though. Yes, that is a global Western phenomenon for sure. It's very interesting.
Yeah, but there is, I mean, the whole thing is about changing roles of men in society, and that's also happening in third world countries, like in Rwanda and Ethiopia. Birth control is quite common. So women's education is rising, their workforce participation is rising, and that's starting to impact on men's roles. So I think it's inevitable that this is a worldwide trend, and especially in Latin America as well. But it's the response and impact is far more well developed in Western countries, and particularly as has been experienced in America in the recent elections of Trump.
What in terms of your journey getting to the point where you're lobbying and like what has been the catalyst for that? I mean, I know you've done men's groups since I've known you and probably before, but like, have you seen there is just a kind of crying out need for more of this support? Like, yeah, I mean, is it kind of plainly obvious that there's a big problem and a big gap in, and just statistically even, and, you know, talking about Australia now because that's where you are, but yeah, to the journey that's led you to this point?
Look, there's a couple of things. It's been the reality for, I suppose, the last 20 or so years that the Progressive Party, the Labor Party, has been focused on women's issues, and that men's well-being, suicide, mental health, feeling part of society hasn't really been their focus. And so when us men have gone to Canberra, you know, the Washington of Australia, we just don't get listened to. Or if we do, you know, nothing happens. I mean, years ago, I spoke to a Liberal minister about getting more male counsellors and retraining men as counsellors. And he thought that was a great idea. But the female heads of the two departments involved, after being asked to consider it, sent him a long letter of saying why none of that was relevant. So I think he thought he had other battles to fight, so he didn't do anything. So that sort of response has been our experience. But what's changed is that men actually vote. And although they mightn't feel they can speak up publicly, when they vote, there's no one to listen. So they've been showing around the world that they're moving to the right or conservative. And, you know, parties who want to be in power, you know, are now discovering that they can't ignore that. It's a fact. So they might have ideological convictions, but that comes at a price. You know, people aren't going to vote for them as much. The other thing is Richard Reeves, an American author, produced a book called Of Boys and Men, Why They're Struggling. And it's a really excellent book. He's an academic and writer. He's English originally. He's now an American citizen. And it took off. Major podcasts like Ezra Klein, Freakonomics, and TV news shows interviewed him. And that was new. You know, that sort of conversation wouldn't have happened before, but his book has now made that conversation acceptable. And the other thing that happened was more personal. I spoke with a Labor member of my electorate a few months ago, or 4 months ago, and I spoke to him about men's stuff. And he was really not very receptive, and almost, when I mentioned some figures to him, he almost said that he thought I was lying.
Really?
And yeah. And, you know, then he said, I'm a feminist. And I told him some stories about my trying to help Indigenous men out west in New South Wales, Wilcannia, helping them reduce domestic violence offending, because that's an area I work in. And I had the police on side, the domestic violence coordinator on side, but every time they spoke to the local federal government, they were knocked back. Like they just weren't interested. They were interested in spending, they just spent $3 million on a women's refuge in Wilcannia, but they weren't interested in doing anything for men, which is stupid. You know, like if you've got domestic violence in Indigenous communities, men are part of it. So you need to work on it. anyhow, I told this politician that as well. And I just said, governments should be ashamed that this is happening, in our community, that this is allowed. And he almost at that stage ushered me to the door, And I got in my car and I was shaking, I thought, what the fuck was that? Here I'm a 79-year-old guy who's worked in progressive politics all his life with homeless men and everything else. I've been at the coalface. I was a Buddhist prison chaplain for 6 years in a maximum security prison. I'm an economist and a researcher. And here's this, middle-aged politician treating me like shit.
Yeah.
And I think that got me going.
It sounds like it did.
So all these factors got thrown in the alchemy pot. And out of this came, okay, it's time now. We've got our federal election coming up in 3 months. It's neck and neck. They all know that the men's vote is important. Now is the time to pick some marginal seats, and my local seat is marginal, and campaign via social media, just saying these are the issues, trying to get response from the people involved, and then asking the politicians, well, what's your response to this? And then publicising that on social media and saying, well, vote for the person that's either going to do the most for boys and men or is prepared to establish an office of boys and men. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
It's a good one. Just the thing that stuck in my head all the way through that is that I'd love to ask that politician what he means when he says I'm a feminist, because it seems to me that that's fine, but that's not really that also doesn't matter. It's like, doesn't mean you can't be that if that's what he is, or if he's just showboating to a particular crowd, which probably he's a politician. You can still be that if you want to be, but still deal with both sides. It seems to me there's a problem here where, you say, because I'm dealing with, being a feminist and dealing with supporting women, I can't go and then deal with men's issues. It seems to me these should just be, well, I'm repeating actually your Richard Reeves link that you put out. It's like, it's great. Yeah, let's, work on equal pay, equal right, all these other things, while we also deal with issues over here. But it seems to me that the two things, one should not influence the other, right? Like, what does he mean? I'd love to ask him what he means when he says I'm a feminist and why that's relevant. I'd like to ask this politician that, but I'm probably not going to be able to interview him. But
I thought his statement was pretty dumb,
Yeah.
Like it was a stupid thing to say. But, some politicians are stupid. That's the reality. He's stepping down and they're having a popular woman stand up in his place. But as Richard Reeves has pointed out, we can do both. Like, we're totally for the maintenance of women's gender equity programs. In proposing an office of boys and men, we're just saying, look, there is no governmental focus at all on boys and men. That's not good. It's not good for boys and men. It's not good for families. It's not good for society. So we can do two things at once. Melinda Gates, who is a feminist and one of the world's richest women, recently gave $60 million to two men's organisations. One of them was Richard Reeves, to help them fund some projects around boys and men. And in doing that, she said gender equity is about women and men rising together.
Mm.
Now, this is all fairly big in terms of social and cultural shifts or political shifts. You know, that wouldn't have been said 2 years ago. But times have changed, and our campaign is going to try and ride on that wave of change. It's there. It's the zeitgeist. People are fed up, mainly in the working class sector, where they're impacted, like the suicides, the mental health problems, the boys' retention at schools. It's mainly evident in the working class areas.
Mm.
And it doesn't really impact the college educated, the well-off groups in society, because they're sheltered from the impacts of the massive social changes. They've got the income, they've got the social support, they can afford to send their kids to really good schools. And that's all great. There's nothing against that. But they're sort of buffered against these changes. The people on lower incomes and less education, they're not. They're in front of the bus. You know, I often say change is like a truck, and there's roadkill, you know. And the roadkill aren't the upper class. They're the lower class. And it's the upper class that dominate the social narrative. I mean, in the media and everything else. And the politicians now, they're all part of that elite class. Like, certainly the Labor Party, most probably the Liberal Party as well, they're all university educated, and many of them, they're career politicians. They've never had a job other than politics.
Mm.
So their world is very separated from those of ordinary Australians.
Well, it sounds like time for change, much like what's happened in the US, but it'll be interesting. I don't know. Has Australia got an election coming up? As I don't actually follow Australian politics.
We've got a federal election coming up, most probably March, April.
Okay.
And I've sent my proposal off to about 9 politicians of both parties, and that's only about a week old. So I wouldn't expect them, by the time it goes through their processes, I wouldn't expect them to get back to me until sometime next week. They may not. I mean, but we're not the only initiative. Like, I think there's a few groups are saying, look, there's time for some changes. And this election is going to be that close that, in fact, we're looking at minority governments. And that's very unusual in Australian politics.
Cool. Let's go back to Mona. I want to get you into the conversation, man. And I suppose the key piece on everything that Paddy just said would be the feminist part. I know you have some pretty strong views on feminism. I wouldn't say, I don't know whether I don't know how you label yourself. You're not,
I
don't strike
call
me
myself,
as a person who likes to use labels, but I know we've talked about it, but interested just to hear your reflections and stuff. So, yeah.
Right. I'm just processing what Paddy was sharing. I think, like, I have never been a full supporter of feminism because I've always had, like, criticism in terms of the kind of fight we are fighting. It always felt, even when I was maybe young adult, felt very unequal, and it felt very unfair in terms of equality, which it was trying to create. So from that perspective, that's why I've always stayed away, like 2 steps away from feminism. But I grew up in India, so I grew up at a time when it was very difficult to be a woman, and I have myself withstand some of the atrocities of that. Like it was very, very common for a young child or a girl to get sexually molested by a stranger, and mostly men. So I can tell you, like, so many women have stories. Like, if I talk to any woman friend of mine, they would always have a story wherein they have been sexually abused or maybe physically abused or verbally abused by a man. Very common. So I always knew instinctively as a child that this was not right. But even when the feminism movement come, I also knew that going against the entire men, race or section of people is also not right. I never supported believe all women, because I know, like, when you say that, it's going to lead to some cases where people will lie, and then it'll maybe lead to some innocent men getting their life getting destroyed by that. So I'm in this weird position where I understand what feminism, why it was started, and why it was needed, because I know women's life has not been easy, especially in modern era, before the voting rights and stuff, and then after that, even in India, like after post independence 1947, it was really bad. But I also see the value of raising these awareness in terms of, like, the issues that men are facing. And I would like to know from Paddy, because you have been doing a lot of work in this area. At least we know what feminism was trying to achieve, which was an equality from a gender perspective. Obviously, like, whenever a movement starts, it starts with a good intention, and eventually we become so attached to the movement that it becomes extreme. And whenever an extreme movement happens, things like toxic masculinity and saying negative things about men comes into forefront, and then we need movements like what you're doing to bring back the scale in the middle. So, but before that, I really want to understand, like, what are the challenges from your research and what the work that you have done so far that you think men are facing, and what do you think is the reason for it? At least we know most of the women's problem were men at that time, and the societal structure. So here, like, for me, it's like a little bit interesting. What's the issue, and challenges that young men face?
Look, I think the best explanation is to tell a story. In 2019, I was president of Tasman Wellbeing, and we held an exhibition called Men with Heart. We have an annual gathering, and we had an award-winning photographer, Paul Holland, and who had, been to, say, about 15 to 20 years of gatherings, and he had some marvelous photography of men at these gatherings that showed a softer, more intimate version of men. So we decided to hold an exhibition, and we called it Men with Heart. And we had it up on mesh scaffolding in an exhibition area. And we asked each man to provide some writing or poetry or something to accompany that. And we had actually luggage tags tied to the net so people could make comments. And we were worried about a feminist backlash criticising it, and we had prepared for that. But the thing that really surprised us, that quite a few women started crying. Wow. And were coming out crying. And they were just really touched by the exhibition. And one woman who was a librarian said, look, I have three boys, and the oldest boy is 16, and he suffers from depression. And when he hears the negative narratives about toxic masculinity or rape or anything else pounding away on the media, he has a major depressive attack, you know. And people talked about husbands and nephews, and it had really tapped into some conversations that weren't being allowed to happen. And we also held some mixed groups. There's men's circles, but we invited women to participate in co-gender groups. And we got heaps of women wanting to participate. And we ran a few groups, and there were really conversations happening that weren't normally happening. So is that somewhat of an answer for you, Mona?
Yes, it is, but also, no, I understand like how this narrative, especially in today's time and especially last 10 years, this narrative has been very prevalent in media, and how it might impact young child or young men, boys specifically, because they're still trying to figure out who they are, and then they hear these stories and they hear these labels that are put onto men as whole. And I can understand like how confusing, how depressive it can be, but I'm still trying to understand much more deeper in terms of like what are other challenges, because this has been maybe like like less than a decade narrative, right? When we look at men committing suicide, and we know that men are committing suicide in higher number than women are, and I also understand that there is this narrative and there is a lot of pressure on men. What do you think is the cause of this? Like, from your perspective, I know like we cannot figure out the entire cause because it's very complex issue, but what are the challenges that men face in their development per se, and that they commit suicide at that higher rate, apart from the narrative that is being fed by the media? Is it the other challenges that they are facing?
Just as a caveat to that as well. Oh, sorry, just as a kind of underwriting to that, because I don't know the stats, but as you answer that, I suppose maybe you can share, Paddy, assuming you do know. I mean, yeah, how much has there been a massive increase in the last 10 years, or has it always been a problem and it's just kind of gradually increased over the last 2 to 3 decades? Because I suppose that I actually don't know based on what Mona's saying. So hopefully I haven't made you forget the question, but I just wanted to add that to it just to set some context.
Look, it's been a phenomenon over the last couple of decades. I mean, as we speak today, 6 men will kill themselves in Australia.
In Australia.
Yeah.
Wow. It's
now the major cause of death for men between, I think, 25 and 40. And in America, it's more aggressive, the growth. And it's growing particular in working class areas or more disadvantaged people. It's sort of the canary in the coal mine, okay? I mean, there's a whole raft of issues, but the suicide rate is the canary in the coal mine. They did a study in Australia some years ago of 250 men who'd made suicide attempts. And they did a text analysis of the conversations they'd had explaining their world before they'd attempted suicide. And the 2 most common words were useless and worthless. And I think at a deeper level, it's not understood that purpose and meaning and having a place in society is far more important than we give it credit for. And we've had absolutely, like our evolution, say over 2 million years, has been for a situation that's totally different to what we have now. We've had changes in our society that are absolutely massive. I mean, the changes for women have been massive, and that's great. Birth control, education, better pay, all that sort of stuff is wonderful. But what's happening at a deeper level with that is it's been so successful that they're doing far better than boys at school. And this is even with working class young women or girls. And boys aren't, they're struggling and they're dropping out. Now, what that means is that the boys in that category no longer become useful as husbands, and the girls, as they become women, are looking for people with better education, better jobs, and that sort of stuff. So you've got a growing group of younger men whose identity over this last 2 million years is as protector provider. That's their function. They don't give birth to children. They're protector providers. And the lower your education and social status, the more your ability to be a protector provider is really important to you. Now, if that goes, they've sort of lost their way. And that's the purpose and meaning, and that's the sense of useless and worthless. Now, there's signs of that occurring in Western countries. And one of the problems is, because of the focus on women's issues, there's actually been very little research on what's happening for men. Like, we know this anecdotally. Like Richard Reeves in his book had access to statistics in schooling and other areas broken down by gender, and it's not talked about in Australia. I found a university professor in education at a university, and I asked him, I said, do you have the gender statistics so you can look at men's performance versus girls? And he said, yes, we do. And I said, well, why aren't you doing it? And he said, well, it's frowned on at university, like it's a career stopper. He said most research is done by PhD students, and they're expected to focus on women and LGBTQ issues. And they don't want to stop their career, so they just don't do it. Now, that's pretty disgraceful that that's happening, but it's been happening for years. So part of the focus for this Office of Boys and Men is actually getting in and doing the research on a lot of this stuff so we can look at program implementation.
Did that answer your question, Mona? I was going to butt in, but I thought I'd let you carry on for a
no,
bit.
I mean, it does. No, I was processing this, and I was trying to understand like why, young men are not performing as well as women, and I was just asking this question to myself: is it because our inherent tendencies, men are much more risk takers, and they have, especially young men. I'm not sure if it is true, and don't quote me on that. But we women, because we go through so much, our body goes through so much changes. We kind of uh, are aware of inherent nature of life, how difficult it can be. And when I think like young women are seeing that men are not providing, that they take up this responsibility, at least like, let me just study hard for myself and provide for myself if no one is there. So probably like they're performing better because there is this underlying fear of safety, and which women tend to crave. And if they don't find it in men, then they have to create on their own, right? So I'm just asking these questions as you were speaking, like what are the causes of like men, specifically young men, not performing? And I agree with you in this case that there should be more research done, and the stigma that has been in these sectors where it stops us from doing any research pertaining to men's rights is not looked down, is not appreciated. So I agree with that, but I'm also like trying to understand what are the deeper reasons behind it. Yeah, I mean that's what I have to say.
Look, I mean, it's a fact that women in all classes are massively improving. Like at university, it used to be more men than women. Now it's more women than men, and this is over the last 30 years, this has happened. That's a massive shift. In the lower levels, I think the schooling system more suits women than men.
Mm.
And women, now that they have more opportunity and they can see that they actually can get better jobs and that education helps them get a job, they're going, okay, we're going to do that. And I think they have far more ability to focus on those goals. They're more future focused, and
Yeah.
there hasn't been a lot of research on it. I'd just say that in evolutionary terms, I mean, women as mothers, they're responsible for
Right.
bringing up children, and they're pretty focused on improving their lot in doing that.
Mm.
And they're more able to focus in that environment than boys. I mean, Richard Reeves talks about looking at some massive programs that were involved in spending money on increasing school retention rates in disadvantaged areas and achieving better school grades. And they found that they only worked for girls. It didn't work for boys.
Mm.
Like, even though there was a program spending lots of money. And they didn't really know why. And he talks about, it's common knowledge that the number of male teachers is decreasing, and the lack of male teachers in schools is an issue. The fact that the current schooling system doesn't support boys, especially in more disadvantaged areas, is acknowledged. And, it requires some, we talk about disruption, in society with all the disruption in social media, AI, robotics and everything else. It's all disruptive, right? And we're having this change. Well, our education systems go back to the dark ages, kids sitting down at desks, being expected to not fidget and focus, like that needs serious disruption.
Yeah.
But and I think that will happen, but we're going to need to put a bomb under it to sort of, it's such an old-fashioned steam train of a system.
Yeah, this is off topic, but it is interesting because I think about it probably 10 times a week. I find it completely crazy that so much has changed, but the education system hasn't. And this affects men and women. It's not, this is a gender neutral situation, but I do not know why. Like it totally, I mean, I was terrible at school, couldn't really concentrate anyway for whatever reason, just didn't think I was very clever. But because I wasn't academic, that's, I think, been fixed a little bit. It's like I spoke on a school thing recently, which amazed me that I was invited to do it because they'd opened like an entrepreneurs class after school. So it was really mad because I'm like opened up by saying, I left school at 16 with like 3 C's, but it amazes me. I mean, it's still, that's like what, 30 years later. And now they're like, wow, we're opening an after school class to teach people I went to an all boys school to teach these boys about, the boys that can't really focus and don't want to be a doctor or or a lawyer or, whatever it is, teach them about actually you can just go out there and work out how to do things. So, anyway, like I say, this is off topic, but it is interesting how it is so prehistoric, the education system everywhere, really. I mean, that seems to be a consistent. There's a lot of pushback in the US right now in terms of, the value of college. I mean, how much value is in college? It's always been the go to school, get your grades, go to college, come out the other end. But arguably 10, 20 years from now, what's that going to get you? I mean, the world is massively changing with AI and jobs being taken. And so, anyway, no question in there, just narrative, and feel free to jump in. And I don't know I think this is probably, well, actually, before I shut up, whether does that have more an effect on, for the fact that women typically, I think, achieve over men academically, and they certainly mature earlier, right? I mean, does this system create, add more problems to the male system in society? I don't know, and when you do put a bomb under the education system, does it need to be thought of in a gender way in terms of how it's reconstructed or changed? So there's a lot in there, but feel free to share.
Yeah, and also what is that bomb looks like? Like what are the changes looks like from your perspective as well? I want to know. Like what will it destroy and what does it aim to recreate?
We just put you in charge of the education department. There you go.
Well, the fact that boys aren't doing as well, especially in the disadvantaged areas, needs to be attended to. Now, the fact that girls are doing a lot better than boys, I don't think at all says that things shouldn't be looked at for them as well. I mean, maybe they can do better still. But the particular problem is for boys. And obviously what's happening is not working. And like in counselling, you say, if what you've been doing is not happening, what makes you think that doing more of it won't get you anywhere, So doing more of what we've been doing isn't a solution, especially in the more disadvantaged areas. And there are no clear programs that I've been able to identify, but I'm not an expert in education. And I think that just really needs to be looked at. And the problem at the moment is, I mean, in Australia, you can't even get the research because the university research is where the research comes from, are discouraged from producing the data. So, I mean, that's a bit of a problem. So we really need, we know it needs to change. In what way, we don't know. We've got to look at it. We've got to look at what's happening around the world, do some research, do some trials. Things are changing. You know, we need to focus on change. And the impact on family structures, you know, is massive. Less family formation, more single households, more single parents. Lower fertility rates. I mean, they're massive. Like in Korea, I think it's down to about 0.8 or 0.7, you know, way below replacement rates. So there are massive changes occurring. Women and men are forming families later in Western societies around the late 20s, early 30s, where fertility is starting to drop. Now, all these changes are happening and we're not doing much about it. We've got AI, we've got space rockets and Elon Musk wanting to go to Mars, and we've got plenty of attention on that. And our politicians really aren't able to speak openly and authentically about what's happening at these deeper levels. They surely must know about it because they're not stupid. But they're also focused on conventional notions of power. You know, if they don't feel it's worth their while, they won't attend to it. So what we're doing is saying, well, actually, men vote, and we want you to start listening to us. You know, the brand platforms that you're selling us, we're not really interested in anymore. It's interesting, in Australia, a recent poll showed that the two most popular politicians were two women. One was Jackie Lambie, who was a senator in Tasmania. She's ex-army, working class background, and she really gets in Parliament and just says it as it is. Tries to look after housing for poor people, army vets and everything else. The other one is an Indigenous senator, Jacinta Price, and she speaks about Indigenous issues, and she just speaks openly and from the heart, you know. And it's fascinating that the two most popular politicians are women who say it how it is. There are no men. I mean, I love it. And I love both those women. And I'm inviting women and men to start speaking up.
Can
Cool.
I add something to this?
Yeah, go for it. Because before you do, just to preface, I've only got about 5 minutes left because I've got someone come around. I feel like this feels like the beginning of a conversation in a way, either we spoke for
I
an
know.
But you
It
know what? We've
does.
kind of gone into this in a bit of an unplanned way, which is great and it's good. But yeah, carry on. I'm okay for another 5-6 minutes. So just, yeah, please carry on. But just wanted to.
Yeah, because I was just thinking about this, the issue that has been brought up by you, Paddy, that men are performing less than women in academic setting. So just a little bit about India also, right? When I was growing up, that was exactly the same case happening because I was in this school system, which was central board, and when they used to tally the results across India between men and women, women were performing better than men. And even in my mom's case, so my mom was much more academically successful than my dad was. And I think one of the reasons that I can think of, and probably it might not be the right one, but is the lack of discipline is probably also causes men, because children needs discipline, and it's very easy for women to get discipline, or a young girl to get discipline and focus on the career or academic. But I think what men or young boys need is strong fathers. And what I notice when I compare with examples from my life is the lack of strong father that was very prevalent in my father's family structure, that he was not able to perform well. But in my mom's family structure, there was a strong male and also strong female, and that's why my mom was, able to perform also. And my grandfather like really encouraged my mom to like do well in school and go to school, even if the society is telling you not to. So there's that aspect that I can think of. So I understand men are facing this problem, and I think if I look at the problem itself, it seems to me, and I might be very naive to say that, but it seems to me it's a very societal and spiritual problem, like as a whole, rather than a political problem in per se. Because I'm not sure, and I might be wrong here, that what all kind of legislation that we can pass, which will make men to perform more. I mean, I understood, like, in terms of women's equality, women were not allowed to attend school, and yes, there was like programs added which allowed them the access to these systems, right? But in this case, men have already have the access. Now the question is if they're not performing well. So I think there is a much more deeper change in terms of what is it that we are, focusing, or what are the values that we are instill, adding to, or what are the values that we are teaching to young child, and what is the foundation of a society that is built on. And I think there, I feel like there is a change that needs to happen more than the political scene. That, and I might be completely naive in that sense, but that's like my 2 cent take on this.
Look, what you say makes a lot of sense. One of the, in terms of discipline and girls being able to buckle down and focus more, much easier than boys. I mean, boys are, more risk-taking, more fidgets, and the decreasing number of male teachers, almost zero now in kindergarten, I think is really important. I mean, there's plenty of research that shows that boys particularly function a lot better in that regard with male teachers. In fact, girls tend to function better as well, with a more balanced gender role. I mean, father figure, mother figures. So that's something that politicians can do. They can earmark money and programs to increase the number of male teachers. Now, that's a big topic, and I've got some ideas. And also, they can spend the money and programs for creating more male counsellors, which impacts on the mental health and suicidality and all that sort of stuff. So there are practical areas where they can do things. And in that it's a spiritual issue, that to me speaks of what our society values. And the concepts of compassion and kindness and wisdom are very much central, say, to Buddhism. But they're not unique. But they're not about materialistic success and power. And when women who are ideologically inclined say, oh, nothing for men, they've got everything, I mean, that's pretty uncaring and unkind. I mean, I've spent a lot of my adult life counselling and a lot of men, and I could tell you tales of suffering that men endure that would make your hair curl, you know. And society as such doesn't seem, in its power structures and cultural institutions, doesn't seem to give a stuff. Okay. So speaking about compassion and kindness and looking at what's happening for boys and men without impacting women's programs needs some sense of compassion and kindness and wisdom, that to have a functioning, healthy society, we need to do something for everybody, because babies, when they're born, they don't have a choice. They don't say, I'm going to be a girl or I'm going to be a boy, you know. They're just born as human beings. And we're all part of society, and we need to function on having opportunities for both to have a healthy society.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
I mean, I agree with you, Paddy. And I know time is running out, but
I've got
I
someone
have
coming around, but
a
that's cool.
lot. Yeah, but I think like
Well-
I have some perspective with respect to Hinduism on this as well, which I would love to like chat. Like I think we should have like one more session wherein we
Well,
take it.
Yeah, definitely.
Because
Well,
I read what you shared, Paddy, like the Buddhism and the feminism part, and I have some insights and some things that I would like to ask you, and something like I would like to share. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
well, I was going to say this was a bit of an experiment, not an experiment. It was a conversation, but it was an experiment as to what the format might be. And often when you do these things, it reveals what should be done next. So yeah, let's have a debrief, whatever you meet. Let's chat. I mean, we can do something else. We could do something with some more structured topics and go into them. But I know, Mona, I can see that you now probably could do an hour of talking. And yeah, I want to encourage you to, chat about some of these thoughts. So let's off, it's 5 minutes. I've got someone come and look at the house, so I can't unfortunately carry on, but we can always do it again. So, but yeah, look, I appreciate you both giving time. Paddy, yeah, always great to catch up and absorb some of your wisdom. That's what comes with age. So look, in there was a compliment and a bit of a dig. But
I mean, Mona, I mean, separate from this podcast, I'd love to do another podcast and we could talk about that. I'd love to communicate and connect with you, say via Zoom, and explore some of this stuff, because we obviously haven't had time to explore our sort of spiritual takes on life. And I think that's important.
Cool.
Yes, would love to. I'd love to, Paddy, for sure.
Awesome. Well, you guys are all linked up on email, so
yeah, I'll send you my WhatsApp as well so that we can stay connected. I hope you have WhatsApp. Or
No,
Facebook Messenger.
Oh, okay,
Facebook
then
Messenger.
Okay, Messenger. Then I'll add you on Messenger.
Yeah, I'll link you guys in a minute on Facebook. So
perfect.
Cool. All right, Paddy. Have a good evening in
okay, mate. Go well.
Tassie, and
meet you,
Mona. See you soon.
Yes.
Cheers.
Same, guys. Nice
Bye.
meeting you. Bye bye.
Muhammad Ali and Sonny Barger, the president of the Hells Angels.
This is 1095